It's a very unusual, confidentially speaking today, because not only have we started late, not only are we using the TV for sound, but I'm also co-hosting this webinar. So it's not just me. It's a confidentially speaking webinar co-hosted with the critical few actions. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Elise Margow. I'm the founder and CEO of Confidentially Speaking, the home of negotiation, and I'm thrilled that John Downs, the founder of the critical few actions, has agreed to co-host a webinar where we unpack the impossible dilemma facing leadership teams when, having nailed their strategy, they're battling to get everybody on board. And today we're going to focus predominantly on how sibling dynamics can exacerbate an already fraught situation and derail strategy implementation. John brings a wealth of experience to this discussion, having over 30 years' experience as a management consultant, first with Deloitte in Melbourne, London, and Chicago, and later through his own practice. He helps founders and CEOs of medium-sized business define their strategic plan, which that's great. So they get their strategic plan, walks beside them as they implement the plans, and then sometimes finds this impossible dilemma when trying to implement, and there's sibling issues that come up. John, let's get started. I've wasted enough time on technical difficulties. Let's get right to it. Tell me about the kind of strategic dilemmas that you find when dealing with family business.
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, Elise, and it's something I could talk about for days, which would put everyone to sleep. But the short version is, um, very few businesses actually have strategic plans. And of those that actually do have strategic plans, many of those plans are actually sitting in the founder's head. The next level towards best practice is to actually go through a structured process to develop a strategic plan. And that's a fantastic process. But my practice is actually all about helping people get outcomes from a strategic plan. Otherwise, I think there's not much point actually preparing one in the first place. What I find is that when I get a senior leadership team engaged in the process of understanding their customer and understanding their current operations and figuring out what their vision and their why is and where they're going to, and then developing the plan together, you typically get alignment. Yes, you will get points of difference of opinion in the room, but you usually will come up with a pretty good collaborative outcome as to what are we going to do month by month for the next 12 months and quarter by quarter for the next 3 years. The reason why you and I started discussing this impossible dilemma is where you have a founder who might have actually started the business 40 years ago, and let's call him Harry for the want of disguising the innocent, because I'm thinking about one right now. So Harry started the business 40 years ago, a manufacturing business. It's doing quite nicely, thanks very much. And he stepped down and left his 3 sons working in the business: Andrew, Marty, and Gary. So Andrew's the older son. So, he's the big brother. And the reason why I call him the big brother is because we've got 3 brothers in the room and they're actually still behaving like 3 brothers in their sub-teenage years. Andrew's working his butt off to preserve the family legacy, to lead the business forward. But then he's also got Marty in there, who's in a key position and doing a great job, sort of, as is Gary, who's also in a key position and he's doing an okay job. But there's different personalities at play, and it's not just a matter of, okay, well, one's the lead on as a CEO, another as a lead of, say, I don't know, sales, and the other one is the leader of, say, production. But all of their decisions can go awry when we're still dealing with the fact that, little Gary is still pretty pissed off at Andrew about the scratch that he put in his brand new skateboard when he was 6 years old. And so he arcs up. And yes, they might have a strategic plan, but actually, Gary thinks that he's got all the answers to every question, but no one's ever listened to him, not over the last 20 years that he's been working in the business. And so he continually wants to go off on a series of tangents. That puts us in this impossible situation where the senior leadership team, which is about 8 people, are looking at the CEO saying, are you running this business or are your brother's running the business? Or they're looking at the CEO and saying, you know what, your brother's being a pillock. Can you just pull him into line? And then, just for the fun of it, you've also got Harry in the background as a continuing shareholder and the chairman of the business, who is sort of saying, well, I started this business with the idea of the kids going into it, and I'd like to leave the business with the kids still in the business. And the simple reality is that maybe Marty and Gary, who aren't the CEO, if they're going to behave like pillocks and disrupt the flow of the entire senior leadership team and throw out the objectives and the progress of the strategy, actually would be better off, happier, working somewhere else where they didn't have to feel subservient to their big brother. So, that's a real life current example, Elise, and I thought this would be a good one for us to kick around.
Yeah.
So how do you think that we should handle, the three warring brothers? Because I know that, I come at from a strategic perspective, and I'm pretty accomplished over 40 years at getting teams to collaborate and to argue through and come up with a mutually agreed plan. But I also know that with all of your experience, both as a lawyer, a litigator, a mediator, and a consigliere of businesses, that you also have very different skills that you bring to the party.
Yeah, so my focus obviously would not be on the actual creation of the strategy, but really in getting people to talk together. And
Yeah.
there I would be using my mediator hat and tools with a commercial and legal knowledge behind me so that I could flag if any real commercial issues are coming up in the discussions, or people should be seeing their lawyers before we even have discussions in order to protect themselves. So,
Yeah.
I have to be very clear which hat I'm wearing when I'm talking to people. And in this case, if I was called in to speak to, well, I suppose we'd leave Harry in the background, the other three brothers, it would be important to almost put on a psychological hat. I say part of mediation is a lot of psychology, not too much law,
Yeah.
and using negotiation techniques to try and resolve disputes. So what we're dealing with first is, and not being a psychologist, but let's talk about it, we're dealing with a whole lot of issues that go way back to childhood, when the oldest son perhaps was given a lot of you know the bright star
Responsibility.
perhaps
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then you had the middle son, who, being the middle son, would have to keep everybody happy, and had middle son issues, and the baby, who perhaps was a favorite to play with but wasn't taken seriously by anybody and had to fight his way. Gary had to fight his way through. And so that's quite hard when you come into a business discussion and start saying, well, now we need to go back to your childhood. So we don't, but we acknowledge it. We acknowledge that there are certain childhood issues that might come up. So how do I deal with it? The first thing is, if I'm brought into this kind of discussion, is to say, well, I need to have facilitated conversations with each person separately and find out where they're coming from. Because, as you said, it could be that there is a problem with the strategy from the perspective of both brothers. They might have great ideas, and they might feel that although the leadership team and the CEO, being the oldest brother, has think this is a great strategy, these guys feel they haven't been heard, and they have some great ideas and input, and they have actually been ignored. So that's the first thing we talk through. So I would be meeting the CEO, I would be meeting each brother and potentially each member of the leadership team and getting their input. But how do I find out information where you've got the leadership team worrying that they might lose their jobs if they say the wrong thing to the about the CEO or any of the brothers? I've got the brothers who don't necessarily want to have some conversations about conflict they have with each other. So we use the mediation confidentiality agreement, basically saying that when each party speaks to me individually, what they say is confidential. I cannot and I undertake not to tell anybody what has been said to me in individual sessions unless the person gives me permission to do so, right? And even then, I would no doubt be promoting that person having the conversation and not me. Because if you're in business and you can't actually have conversations with each other, we're already seeing a flaw. So
Yeah.
that's how we start off. We start the facilitated conversation, but it's first an individual discussion with each member of the team and the three brothers to find out where they're coming from. Of course, I'd have to be brief, but sometimes what happens is more information comes up during this this discussion, and then we might have to change where we're coming from.
Yeah.
So, does that?
Yeah, we're not talking about taking them through an intense stream of psychotherapy. But what we are doing is actually giving them a safe place to actually have
Yeah,
a confidential conversation
yeah,
and talk through the issues and part of the reasons as to why they're actually either arcing up or going off piste or
yeah,
where they don't feel like they're being heard.
yeah.
And what I find is that, you know, I also when I'm developing a strategy or facilitating a leadership team to develop their strategy, I typically actually start off with a series of one-on-one interviews to actually understand the lie of the land and what their responses are, and also to get a sense as to how they feel the team's working together or not, because that's an important part of it. When I'm working through each of those four stages of the strategic plan development process, we run those in workshops. But we also set the ground rules at the start of each of those workshops that we are all equals and peers, and that Andrew doesn't have any more power in the room than Gary does, or Marty, or Helen, or Rosie. And so that sort of sets the ground rules. And sometimes we have to restate those ground rules as we go through half a day or a full day workshops. But it's a very important point. Um, Funny enough, it's interesting when you have conversations with some members of a senior leadership team and often with younger brothers or sisters in a family, you will hear those exact words, Elise, and that is, you know, nobody actually listens to me, or I've had this idea for the last 10 years and no one's done anything about it. Um, and of course that creates a little bit of resentment and angst. So, you know, it's a real scenario, and it takes quite a bit of navigation.
It does. And, you know, the difference as well, when you're sitting around the table, even if you've spoken to people, if your job is to help them build a strategy, you can't say, well, I'm going to hold back some information.
Yeah,
Because your job is to facilitate that. If my job is to facilitate the conversation or the difficult conversations, what I would do is actually challenge Gary. And I'd say, so you feel you haven't been listened to. This is now private conversation, obviously not
yes,
within the team and in the confidential hub. And I'd say, well, you know, Gary, you actually have, I hear what you're saying and you know, absolutely you've been heard, but why do you think they're not listening to you? Because what I'm hearing is this: have you thought that the way you're delivering the message is not being heard because it's the manner and the content. People are not hearing you because although the content might be good, you're not articulating what you say in a manner that's going to be heard, understood, and acted upon. Because I think with all of us, and I know I'm to blame as well, I get an idea in my head. I get so excited about it. I think it's brilliant. I think you, John, are being so mean to me because you won't let me get, center stage and run with it. But I don't hear myself or what I sound like to other people. And so the idea might be good, the content might be good, but I'm saying it in a manner that either puts people offside or doesn't really align with how they think. So
Yeah.
we're already at odds because I'm speaking to you in a way that you're not gonna appreciate what I'm saying. But I also take into point that Gary might be still regarded as the younger brother who knows nothing. That might also be an issue. But, sometimes it is just that you're articulating. And maybe Gary needs to say, I know I'm the younger brother. I know that you have had years of experience. And that's the kind of coaching I would do. How does Gary get his point across? Obviously, if what Gary's saying is nonsense, that's another point altogether, which we can get to. But
Look,
let's first go, give him some form of respect and say he might have a good point that just isn't being heard.
well, look, I think you've hit the nail right on the head because I'm looking at and visualizing Gary as we speak. And the reality is he's had some brilliant ideas
Yeah.
over the years. But, sometimes the problem is the solution. And, his complaint that no one listens to me. Um, or I had this idea 10 years ago and no one actually did anything about it, actually highlights actually the bigger issue. And the bigger issue is, or the problem is, not that the idea was a dud idea. It's just that the way that he communicates his ideas actually shuts people down so that they don't feel that even if they responded,
Mm.
they don't think they'd be heard. So whilst he's complaining about the fact that no one listens to him, part of the problem might also just be that actually he doesn't listen to anybody else.
Exactly.
No one feels safe to actually tell him the truth anyway. So your expression, it might be the manner in which he expresses his ideas, could be the failing point. And I think, we all know people who do have good ideas, but we don't necessarily want to hear them.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm working at the moment with a leadership team. They're not related to each other, which makes it slightly easier. But I've sat at a table with them, and each and every one wants their say, and very few are listening to each other. There is a reason there's something fraught happening, but they aren't listening to each other. They want to be heard, but they're not prepared to give the respect to the other to be heard as well. Now, that's not the entire leadership team, but there's at least 5 out of 8 who are like that. And so that's part and parcel of creating a culture within your business of listening and hearing. And if you're going to put, you miss so much if you don't. And there's personalities as well. Are you that leader who needs to have complete control? Are you too empathetic? I've had one, CEO, he's so empathetic that everybody's walking all over him.
Yeah.
And he can't get anything out, because of that. So it is that dynamic of creating a culture and of hearing, articulating, and respecting the other in the way we put forward our ideas. And that's really where mediation and negotiation comes in, isn't it? Because as part of negotiation, what we're trying to do is to persuade the other to give us what we want. And
Yes,
we
it
can
is.
only persuade them if we speak to them in a manner that they will hear us and be prepared to
Yes.
accept what we
Yeah.
say.
And then when they feel heard, then
Yeah.
they're more able to synthesize how um, providing what you want, as you
Yeah.
say, is actually in their best interests and
Exactly.
works really well for them.
Yes.
Um, so, you know, when you said um, uh, that we need to actually establish a culture of listening and feeling psychologically safe to actually express our opinions and also make mistakes, um, then that's a huge step forward for most cultures.
That's such a good point. Some people might be averse to the word of safe space. I know a number of people in commercial say safe space. Don't mention the safe space, but it is a safe space in a way, because you're dealing with, I mean, so many people say, but I'm employed by these people. If I say what I think, if I challenge the CEO, if I challenge the board, what will happen to my employment?
Yeah.
So maybe they'll allow me to say what I have to say now. And I've had one person who thought she could just say what she wanted, because, and the next thing she was out of they found some reason to dismiss her, not because she was a bad performer, just because they found that she was just too overt with her ideas and they didn't like the way she came across. So you always have this tension between how can I express myself if I'm not the one who chooses who's employed and who isn't employed. How does the CEO create a space where people can talk but not be disrespectful? It's very difficult. It's like a tightrope. But at the very least, there should be an ability to give your ideas. And in some cases, we might suggest, and I know at one company where I worked, there was an anonymous suggestion box
Yeah.
where people, you could say after the meetings or whatever, you can actually put your suggestions in the suggestion box. You can type it out so it's de-identified. And it's not one person, but two people would open it, put that forward, and put it to the team. So it wasn't even coming from a specific person. It was just, these were the ideas that came out of this a suggestion box. Let us discuss them. That's not what a means of negotiating, but it is a means of creating a safe place for people to be able to speak freely of things they would like to see changing in the business, or something to be included in the strategy without fear.
Absolutely. And as cliche as it's starting to sound, a bit like the word pivot, psychological safety is, and creating a safe place for communication at work
Yeah.
is no longer just an important idea from a management theory perspective. It's actually now enshrined in human resources law.
Mm.
Um, from the perspective of a work safe and work cover perspective, we have to be able to create a psychologically safe environment as well as a physically safe environment. But
Exactly.
that issue about Andrew, Marty, and Gary, well, psychological safety when you're a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old does involve giving your brother a boof on the head. And perhaps taking his skateboard off him because it's cool and going for a spin on it. And if you now think about, those same individuals in their 50s,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of that stuff still hasn't gone by the by, though that pecking order that got established. And some of that sort of those resentments can still be quite deeply ingrained. And you know, one of the real factors in whether or not you can resolve this is really how emotionally intelligent, not their IQ, but their emotionally intelligent, each of the brothers is, and how prepared they are to actually have the conversations in a well considered, uh, respectful way.
Well,
And that may not be resolvable.
no, although, John, I think putting on some boxing gloves and sending them out to box each other first might actually not be a bad idea with siblings. Just get some of that aggression out and said, okay, now that you've buffed each other on the head, let's have the chat.
That sounds like an intelligent conversation instead of an emotional one.
Yeah, let's just get some of that physical anger out and let's have a conversation. And I joke, but it's sometimes you need that. Sometimes you need to scream scream and shout and get that out of you before you're in a fit space to have a conversation and intelligent and logical conversation. I don't know about you, John, but I've got two older brothers. So I'm the little Gary here. I feel a lot for Gary. And I've had to punch my way, I mean, I'm also the shortest in the family, so I've had to punch my way up quite a bit. And sometimes you're so angry at them and you can't think logically. So what do you do? And I think part of my role when I come in is to let people get that anger out, get it out, scream at Elise. I can then tell them whether I think it's worthwhile them speaking and screaming at the brother and saying, I think you should hear each other, just scream at each other for a while. Not that I would do that, but but being able to just get the anger out, the frustration out is so important because I can't hear you if I'm so frustrated. I can tell you my middle brother and I felt so sorry for my mother and father because we really would go at each other and we couldn't hear each other.
Yeah.
So at an older, as you get older, obviously you learn different techniques, but having someone else you can scream and shout at in a business was confidential, and then they say, fine, you've got that anger out. Now let's talk about how we're going to talk to your brother so he can hear you.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know. Yeah.
Well, the resolution of those, you may not resolve the issue
Mm.
of their childhood angst,
Yeah.
but I'm totally convinced that with 99% of participants,
Mm.
that you can actually help them feel heard and help them actually then have a conversation with their peer or their sibling or their CEO or indeed their father in a way that is constructive and allows both parties to actually listen to each other and hear each other
Yeah, and that
and
part of
make
that.
steps forward.
Exactly. And part of that is actually preparing both of them to hear each other. So it's not a
Yeah.
one-sided conversation, but hear both each other. And so part of, it's a mediation technique, it's a negotiation technique that you would say,
Yeah.
well, if you were in the position of Gary, how would you feel if you were treated like this? How would
Right.
you feel if every time you spoke, you were seen as the lesser, that your ideas, how would you, and how would you respond?
Yeah.
What would you do if this happened? If you were Gary, how would you have responded? And I find almost 80% of the time when I put that question to people, they suddenly realize that the response of the person who was upset wasn't as bad as they thought it was. They could
Yeah.
actually empathize. And with empathy comes an understanding of how then to cope with a person who is in that position. Now, I'm sounding very academic, I think, when I say that, but it is that when I can hear you, for example, Joan, if I suddenly put myself in your shoes and see you as the strategist and what you're trying to accomplish, and then see, me screaming at you when I'm playing you, I'm thinking, well, this isn't going to impress John and it's not going to get me very far. How I should have behaved was X. And I self-correct. And when I start self-correcting, I'm then in a better position to approach you and say, John, perhaps the way I expressed myself put you off, but this is what I was trying to achieve.
So, I think that this is not an uncommon
Mm,
situation.
mm,
I've actually seen this a number of times, but it's interestingly, I've also seen it where it's not between siblings, it's between parent and child. Father has handed the business down, or the child, let's call him a son, let's say Andrew, in fact, we'll continue on with Harry and Andrew. So Andrew has worked in the business, worked his guts out in the business, frankly. Um, and he's finally stepped up to be CEO. And partly that's because he was the right person to do it, but also partly because nobody else was prepared to take it on. And Dad, Harry, wanted the business to be run by a family member.
mm,
You've then got the challenge of, okay, well, as Harry transitions out of CEO into chairperson and being distant from the business, there can be a whole raft of problems of Harry letting go.
mm,
there can be a raft of challenges of Andrew stepping up and is he really the right person to do this, and may have his own insecurities about that. Um, and then you also find, because the families are wonderful, that there's a whole series of conversations going on with Harry that don't actually include the CEO, Andrew, because people are still having another chat with Dad, or Andrew's not doing a great job, thanks, Dad, or he's not listening to me about this great idea I've got, Dad. And so Dad's now getting a distorted view because he's not actually seeing what's happening. And he's, of course, tempted to protect the business and protect each of his children. And he actually finds himself in that impossible situation, which he's had for, all the kids' lives, of trying to actually appease all of them. Do you see that at all when you're in your space, Elise?
I actually see less of Dad trying to appease everyone in the founder space and more of Dad trying to impose, Dad
Control
and
everything.
Mom trying to impose their will on each of the people of the children, of having chosen who is the best and brightest in their mind, or who they want to continue the tradition. And that might not necessarily be the most competent person. In fact, in many cases, it's not. So it could be the person they believe they can control the most to take the business in the direction they want, because it takes quite a strong founder to say, I started this business, I've done really well, I've taken it to a step, and I'm prepared to sit back and let my children decide what the next step is in the process of where they're taking the business and strategically planning for the future. So I often find there's this tension between the younger generation wanting to change things, go off in a different strategic direction, rightly or wrongly, and the founder is like, no, I'm trying to still pull the strings, and the child who's most likely to be more like me is the one who's going to get there, not necessarily the better leader or the thinker. So I've actually very rarely seen the founder wanting to help be nice to everyone. But that may be the people who come to me because, I'm not the big strategic thinker here. I'm the lawyer and the nasty person that people come to when they've got issues. And how we deal with that is really difficult. I call it unpacking the too hard basket, and it's part of a greater discussion on succession planning and estate planning that we have to have, which then the strategy of the business is important, but it's one of a number of issues that we have to unpack to move forward. So how do I deal with the founder in that situation? Obviously, I'd meet everybody before, as we've discussed, and try and get as much information and background information from everybody. I try to make them think about the future with the children. And I try to say to them, at some stage, although we don't like to think about it, we're no longer going to be on this earth. Do we want our children speaking to each other? Do we want our family, stripped apart by warring factions? Is what you want to put in place worth that?
Yeah.
And I can be very direct about that because I'm coming in as the supposed person trying to relieve a dilemma and a dispute. But it's a difficult conversation to have and to think about.
Well, but it's an essential conversation for founders to think about, because they can't rule from the grave
Yeah.
with a piece of paper. And, a lot of these tensions, a lot of these uh, background issues and behaviours or misbehaviours are simply the result of conversations that have been avoided, possibly for decades. Now, I'm conscious of time, and if there are any questions, people should pop them in the chat so that we can respond to them. But this issue of, is what's going to be the family legacy, and what's most important for the family? Is what is most important for the family that the siblings actually support each other going forward? Or is the business more important than that? It's funny, wasn't funny, it was quite serious. You know, from a personal perspective, I went and saw a financial planner with my sister just a few months ago to talk about what was going to happen with my 89-year-old mother, whose health is deteriorating. And so we were just talking about, what were the financial issues that we needed to be aware of. The planner said something to us that actually stopped us in our tracks when she said, your mother and father have left you a fantastic legacy. And we looked at each other and thought, well, yes, they've left us. They will leave us a small but very kind bequest. And the planner said, no, it's got nothing to do with the bequest. The legacy that your parents have left you is the way I'm watching the two of you working together to look at how to look after your mum, and the way that you both respect each other, and how effectively you're communicating as a team. That's the legacy that they're leaving behind. The money is irrelevant. And I thought that was a really interesting insight, and actually, frankly, something for my sister and I to be quite proud of. And it's a question that I think is really important for founders as they're passing a business down to the next generation and possibly the generation beyond. Is what sort of legacy are they looking to create? And are they going to create a legacy that actually binds or supports or tears their family apart?
Exactly. And, in some cases, if the business is so important, maybe you shouldn't be leaving it in the hands of your children. And I say that unless you've got the most incredibly talented children and they can work well in the business and you see that and you can see how it works up. But sometimes the nature of the business is such that you put the wrong child in the business. And as we know in the story of dynasties, by the third generation, most of these family businesses flounder and go away. I'm not going to say I put into administration or liquidation or whatever, but there are very few family businesses that stay the distance for generations. So looking at that, maybe if you've got really brilliant children in the business, they're doing well, that's the time to have the conversation, and early on when they start in the business, not when you decide to drop them in it because you're moving out. Bring them in early. But there might well be a thought to say, well, for this business to survive, my children shouldn't be dealing with that. And I'm not that up on the Maya Foundation, but I do think that the Maya Foundation was created so that the generations of Mayas after the founder could still enjoy the business, but they weren't running the business. The business was to be run by professionals. And I'm not about to give advice on trusts and how you set up a foundation. No. That's not the purpose. But this is quite an interesting way of dealing with family issues. And we've got totally off the point of the three brothers, I'm just saying, John, but that's okay.
But it actually does relate specifically to those three brothers again. If we look at the largest family businesses in Australia that are multi-generational, most of them now have a family office that advises the descendants of the founder on how to operate and run those businesses, and often runs those businesses for them. But I also am finding with a number of my mid-sized clients that those founders are now looking at, they're in the retirement zone, they're in the 60 to 75-year-old age group, and they're looking at their businesses from the point of view of, okay, well, how do I exit this, either for my children to take it over or exit it so that I don't have to participate in it anymore, and we liquidate the asset, or we sell the asset to private equity. And that conversation, whether they there's two parts to it. One is, how do they make themselves redundant from the business, and again, that's about how do we prepare Andrew, Marty and Gary to run the business, or how do we become redundant from the business by having a new CEO come in and do it who might be outside the family, so that we can enjoy the business as an investment as opposed to our working life. And that then means, how do we prepare the children to actually manage that as an asset as opposed to something that they're going to meddle in? So, you know, the simple reality is with Andrew, Marty, and Gary, you know, there are real questions that need to be asked and are often avoided around, okay, well, is working in this business the best thing that you should do for you professionally, as a career, as a potential parent, and as a pursuit? And if not, what can you be doing that would actually provide you with more fulfillment and make your life feel more worthwhile?
It's such a
So
good
they
point.
may have to leave.
Yeah. Such a good point, John, as to also looking at what the children want. Maybe earlier on, if Harry had spoken to Gary and Marty, he might have found out they didn't want to be in the business.
Yeah.
But it's just, there is one question that's come in and said, let's get back to the three siblings being capable in the business. So it's not a question of wanting to kick them out, I guess. And what happens is the brother who is the CEO is the problem, not the other siblings. How do the two other siblings negotiate a change in leadership of the business without exploding the family? Should I throw that to you first?
Look, it's a very good question, and something that we've had to address in the past, particularly where you're seeing that it's fracturing a senior leadership team.
Yeah.
The senior leadership team is not the forum to resolve this issue. The board is actually, and if there isn't a formal board, the family board is the only place to actually resolve this issue. So for a start, we need to actually have the right quorum of decision makers. The second thing that we need to do is to actually get some independent participants to actually help broker those conversations, but also to make sure that, Marty and Gary aren't just ganging up on Andrew the way they have for the last 40 years, because they might be completely convinced of their own omnipotence and their eminence, whereas they might be also completely ill-advised about their own contribution and their own skill. Everybody's got their own personality quirks. So getting some independent support in for the founder, Harry, the chairperson, is possibly going to be a very important part, and understanding what are the roles that these three have, how are they being, what are those role descriptions, how are they performing against those role descriptions, and if there's performance issues, how do we actually help them either meet the improved performance or call out the behaviour and the performance issues, which are often also conversations that are typically avoided.
And I suppose here it comes to who are the right advisors at the table, because often what will happen is they'll bring in a financial advisor, maybe a business advisor, someone like you, John, who's strategically great. And there are other people they don't bring in. So, for example, I call what I bring to the table when I'm not the lawyer, but as the mediator person, the person who can help people articulate and find out where they're coming from. If you don't have that at the table, potentially you've got a little bit of aggression and emotion that does not assist us to try and resolve the issue. So I almost think you need to bring in your bouquet of advisors, but make sure you're not paying a fortune by having the wrong people in the room either. So if I'm having a lawyer, I just want to know what the legal rights and objectives are. If I've got the, strategic advisor normally sits there anyway because there's a lot to do with strategy, but financial advisor, what does it mean financially? I shouldn't have all of them in the room at the same time, too many cooks and all that. But the reality is there are times when you need people with more soft skills to be assisting in the discussions. And I think there's a lot of pushback against that because it's seen as light and fluffy and not necessary in the big arm of the business.
Well, if it
Yeah.
is seen as light and fluffy, then that's a massive mistake
Yeah.
because you're not having the people with the right tool set in the room. The reality is that if there's interpersonal skill, if there's interpersonal angst issues between the siblings and the founder, or the siblings and each other, um, having the accountant in the room, and quite often the only other independent person on a board is an accountant, who's been the accountant for the founder Harry for the last 25 years, and it does a great tax return and a set of statutory accounts. But apart from his professional role, he's also now got a personal role with the founder, and has probably heard the founder talk and whinge about his children. Mm. So that doesn't make him equipped at all to help with this sort of discussion. Mm. Helps him look at the accounting side of it, and all respect to that, but certainly is not the right person to actually help broker conversations that are respectful and safe, and to hear confidentially the issues for each of the participants, all four of them, and then actually help host a collaborative series of conversations that'll get a resolution. And so there's nothing light and fluffy about bringing in someone like you, Elise, to deal with these tough issues that, frankly, people have been avoiding for decades.
Yeah, it's so true. I just saw we are almost coming to the end, but there is one more question.
Sure.
What if you are the, member of the leadership team, interesting, in this family dynamic, where you see the tension between the brothers? They all, each individually is trying to get you on your good side and get your vote and influence you. How would you help the leadership team members in the middle of this dilemma, where the children are coming to them and trying to influence them?
Yeah, and look, the simple reality is this isn't an unusual question. This is the unspoken question of every member of the leadership team that's not in the family, because they've been looking at the way the brothers have been behaving for most of the time that they've been with the business. So it's another one of those conversations that's been avoided, either because of concern about repercussions or vindication. And the simple reality is it needs to be surfaced. It needs to be surfaced both with the CEO and with the founder or the chairperson. And they may need help to do that, either from an independent outsider, or they may need to do that through other communications means, whether they be confidential or anonymous. But one of the things that I always think about when a member of the senior leadership team resigns is people don't resign from businesses. They resign from their manager. And so if a member of the SLT who's not a family member feels that they can't find a safe way to have this conversation, simple reality is they'll leave. And so not only have you got a dysfunctional family group cohort in the senior leadership team, you may well have lost one of your best senior leaders as well. And that's a disaster. So we need to be able to try and create an environment where it's safe for them to bring this up.
It's so true. I like that you resign from your manager, not the business. The one thing I'd also suggest is, we talk about within boards, when you're on a board and you want to, achieve something. You meet everybody individually and have a cup of coffee and see where the land lies. You've got to be careful, obviously, because you don't know where people's loyalties lie and whether someone's going to stab you in the back.
Yeah.
But it's worthwhile also speaking to people, fellow leadership team members over a cup of coffee, just seeing where the land lies, how they're feeling, because perhaps as a group and a team, you might be in a better position to put forward a suggestion than as an individual when you're dealing with confronting the family beliefs and how they proceed, or trying to get involved, which you don't want to do in a family fight.
Yeah.
So I'm very aware that it is now coming to the end of the webinar. I don't see any more questions out there. So I think that's about it. John, is there anything else you want to add?
Look, the only thing I would say is if there was one thing that I think we should leave this conversation with is that don't let it fester. If these conversations are not going to be had, it will only get worse. It's never going to get better. As far as I'm concerned, time does not heal all. Time actually makes things worse because of the conversations that are avoided. So if you're dealing with this sort of issue at the moment, or you're feeling that this is an issue at the moment, call it out. Don't let it fester.
That is brilliant advice, John. I couldn't say it better. Always rather confront at the beginning, because it's easier to resolve something when it's starting to sprout, as opposed to when it blooms into a full-blown explosion. So thank you very much. From your perspective, if people want to find you and get hold of you, where can they find you?
Oh, thank you. Yes, easily you can find me on the w's.criticalfewactions.com.au. criticalfewactions.com.au.
Great. And if you want to contact Confidentially Speaking, firstly, we've got our website, confidentiallyspeaking.com.au. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. For now, have a lovely day. Apologies for the beginning, but that was our impossible dilemma that we managed to overcome to begin this webinar, and we hope to keep talking through the year.
Thanks, Elise. It's been a delight.
Thanks, Joan.